When Silent Hill crossed the line. There's a moment in every horror franchise where creators face a choice. Play it safe, stay within comfortable boundaries, let the scares remain surface level, entertainment that audiences can walk away from without carrying the weight, or push further, go darker, cross lines that other games won't cross, explore territories that make people genuinely uncomfortable, create horror that doesn't just startle but unsettles on a psychological level that lingers long after the console powers down. Silent Hill chose to cross those lines repeatedly, unapologetically. From its very first entry in 1999, the franchise established itself as willing to explore taboos that most games avoided entirely. Child torture, sexual abuse, religious fanaticism taken to horrifying extremes, imagery so disturbing that ratings boards in multiple countries demanded cuts and modifications, content so psychologically intense that even Team Silent, the original development team, wondered if they'd gone too far. This is the story of when Silent Hill crossed the line, not once but many times. Some of this content made it into the final games. Some was cut before release. All of it reveals a franchise willing to use horror not as simple entertainment but as a tool to explore the darkest corners of human psychology and the most painful aspects of human trauma. These aren't jump scares. These aren't monsters that exist simply to chase you through corridors. This is horror designed to make you confront things you'd rather not think about, to force you to witness suffering that makes you want to look away, to place you inside the minds of people experiencing trauma so profound that reality itself warps around them. The question isn't whether Silent Hill crossed the line. The question is whether crossing those lines made the games more meaningful or simply more disturbing, whether the content served a purpose or existed purely for shock value, whether Team Silent understood the responsibility that comes with depicting trauma, or whether they sometimes wandered into territory that felt exploitative rather than exploratory. Let's walk through that fog. Let's examine the moments when Silent Hill pushed boundaries, when it made players and critics question whether games should be allowed to depict certain things, when it forced conversations about what horror can and should be. Some of these moments are brilliant, some are questionable, all of them are unforgettable. The foundation, Alessa's burning Silent Hill, established its willingness to cross lines immediately with the backstory of Alessa Gillespie. Not subtext, not implied horror happening off screen. The game's entire narrative foundation rests on the explicit torture of a child, and Team Silent made sure players understood exactly what happened to her. Alessa was 7 years old when her mother, Dahlia Gillespie, decided her daughter would serve as the vessel to birth the Order's god. The cult believed that immense suffering was necessary to nourish the deity growing within Alessa's body. So they burned her alive. They took a child to their hidden church, placed her on a metal grate above burning coals, and immolated her while conducting their ritual. The ceremony went catastrophically wrong. The coals overturned. Fire spread throughout the church and into the coal mines beneath Silent Hill, creating the poisonous fumes that would force the town's evacuation. But that wasn't the worst of it. Alessa survived. Horribly, impossibly, she survived. When Officer Gucci found her, she was burned over most of her body, skin blackened and peeling, kept alive only by the very power the cult had tried to harness. She was taken to Alchemilla Hospital, where she spent the next 7 years in a state of constant agony, wrapped in bandages, unable to move, experiencing pain so intense and unrelenting that it fractured her soul. Her suffering was so profound that it literally warped reality, creating the other world and eventually drawing Harry Mason into the nightmare that would become the first Silent Hill game. This isn't backstory mentioned in a note you might miss. The game makes sure you understand what happened to Alessa through multiple revelations, through the physical evidence you find, through the manifestation of the nightmare itself. You see her burned body. You encounter the gray children, creatures born from her trauma with charred skin and cracks of fire showing through. You walk through environments that reflect her pain, through fire and rust and decay. The entire town of Silent Hill becomes a monument to child torture, transformed by the agony of a 7-year-old girl who was betrayed by her own mother. Most games in 1999 wouldn't touch child endangerment at all, let alone make it the foundational trauma of their entire narrative. But Team Silent understood something crucial about psychological horror. The most disturbing things are often the most real. Religious cults have abused children. Parents have sacrificed their children's well-being for their beliefs. These horrors exist in our world, and pretending they don't actually makes the horror less effective, not more palatable. The Silent Hill film adaptation in 2006 took this concept even further, adding a sexual assault component. In the movie, young Alessa is raped by the school janitor before being burned by the cult. This addition proved controversial among fans, with some arguing it added unnecessary trauma to an already horrific story, while others felt it completed the picture of a child failed by every system that should have protected her. The janitor, Colin, becomes one of the film's most disturbing monsters, strung up with barbed wire in the same bathroom stall where he assaulted Alessa, forced to crawl with barbed wire threaded through his genitals, his eyes gouged, his tongue blackened and lashing. The design isn't subtle. It's meant to depict a sexual predator, punished in ways that directly relate to his crime, created by a child's understanding of cosmic justice. Whether the film's additions improved or diminished Alessa's story remains debated, but the core concept from the game remains powerful precisely because it doesn't flinch. Team Silent didn't sanitize Alessa's story. They didn't keep the worst of it off screen. They made sure players understood that this child suffered horrifically, that her own mother facilitated that suffering, that she remained in agony for years while the people who burned her walked free. And they made sure you understood that all the horror in Silent Hill, all the monsters and nightmares and twisted realities, stem from that original sin. The town's darkness isn't random. It's the scream of a tortured child given physical form. The nurses, sexual symbolism, and medical horror. When Silent Hill 2 introduced its most iconic monster design, the bubblehead nurse, it crossed another line entirely. These weren't monsters that represented fear of hospitals or medical trauma in the abstract. These were explicitly sexualized creatures, designed to embody protagonist James Sunderland's guilt over his sexual frustration during his wife Mary's terminal illness. Team Silent wasn't being subtle. The nurses wear low-cut uniforms with exposed cleavage. Their movements are suggestive, and their very existence in James's personal hell reveals his shame over objectifying the nurses who cared for his dying wife. The design is brilliantly disturbing. The nurses' heads are wrapped in latex-like material that causes them to convulse and twitch, representing both Mary's suffocation when James killed her and the swelling of Mary's face during her illness. The masks force their heads backward at unnatural angles, creating something that looks almost sexual in its contortions while simultaneously being deeply wrong. They carry pipes as weapons, a callback to the first game, but also phallic symbolism that's impossible to miss. Art director and monster designer Masahiro Ito has been explicit about the nurse's meaning. In numerous interviews and social media posts over the years, He's confirmed that the bubblehead nurses represent James's perspective, filtered through his guilt and sexual shame. James wasn't seeing the nurses at Brookhaven Hospital as people. He was seeing them as sexual objects, which his guilt then twisted into something monstrous. The nurses embody the uncomfortable truth that James experienced sexual desire and frustration even as his wife was dying, that he looked at other women in ways he knew were wrong, that his mind went to places he despised himself for going. This is where Silent Hill separates itself from most horror. Other games might have nurses as enemies. They might make them look creepy or zombie-like, but only Silent Hill would make them explicitly sexual as part of the horror, would force players to confront the protagonist's shameful thoughts rather than just his fear of hospitals. The nurses aren't scary because they're attacking you. They're scary because they reveal something deeply uncomfortable about James's psyche, and by extension, they make players consider their own capacity for objectification and inappropriate desire in inappropriate contexts. The sexual symbolism became controversial almost immediately. Some critics argued Team Silent had simply created fan service under the guise of psychological depth. Others felt the design was brilliant precisely because it made people uncomfortable in ways that pure monster design never would. The debate intensified when later Silent Hill games and the film adaptation started using sexy nurses without necessarily understanding why they worked in Silent Hill 2. The nurses began appearing in contexts where they didn't make thematic sense, their sexual appearance becoming a franchise trademark rather than a specific manifestation of James's guilt. Masahiro Ito himself has expressed frustration with this evolution. He's repeatedly stated that the sexy nurses should only appear in James's story because they're specifically about his sexual frustration and guilt. When Silent Hill Homecoming featured pregnant demon nurses with exposed bellies and jiggle physics, Ito noted this felt like fan service divorced from meaningful symbolism. The nurses had become sexualized horror icons rather than symbols of a specific character's trauma. The remake of Silent Hill 2 reignited this debate when early screenshots showed the nurses with less overtly sexual designs. Some fans complained that censorship had ruined the monsters. Others pointed out that Ito himself has said the original nurses weren't meant to look like the hypersexualized versions that appeared in later games and films. The conversation revealed how audiences had internalized one interpretation of the nurses while the original creators had a different, more restrained vision. But the core concept remains boundary pushing regardless of specific implementation. Silent Hill 2 asked players to confront a protagonist who experienced sexual frustration while caring for his dying wife, who looked at other women and felt desire mixed with guilt, whose shame over these feelings manifested as twisted, latex-wrapped nurse monsters. That's not horror that lets you maintain comfortable distance. That's horror that makes you consider whether you'd feel similarly in James's situation, whether you'd have those same shameful thoughts, whether your guilt would create the same nightmares. Angela's Hell, depicting sexual abuse. If the nurses pushed boundaries by depicting sexual frustration, Angela Roscoe's storyline in Silent Hill 2 crossed far more serious lines by depicting the aftermath of sexual abuse. Team Silent approached this subject with remarkable care and disturbing honesty, creating one of the most haunting depictions of trauma in any medium. Angela appears throughout James' journey through Silent Hill, a young woman clearly dealing with severe psychological damage. She's skittish around James, alternating between desperate attempts at connection and sudden hostility. She's searching for her mother, she says, though her father and brother should be there too. But as James progresses, the truth emerges in fragments. Angela killed her father. She stabbed him multiple times, in the neck and torso, and the reason becomes horrifyingly clear in the labyrinth section of the game. James hears Angela's voice screaming, "Daddy, no, please don't." He enters a room lined with flesh, mechanical piston thrusting in and out of holes in the walls. There he finds Angela cowering before abstract Daddy, one of the most disturbing monster designs in gaming history. The creature appears to be two figures trapped together on a bed frame, a larger form pinning down a smaller form that seems to be screaming, both encased in stretched skin. The sexual imagery isn't subtle. The thrusting piston in the walls, the bed frame, the positioning of the figures, the way Angela cowers frozen in terror rather than fighting back, all of it screams sexual violence. After James defeats the creature, Angela viciously kicks it and throws a television on it. She's shaking, crying, barely coherent, and then she turns on James with sudden hostility, accusing him of only being nice to her because he wants something sexual from her. James protests that he's not like that he's just trying to help. Angela doesn't believe him. "You're the same as them. You only care about yourself. Selfish, disgusting pig." The game never explicitly states that Angela was raped. It doesn't need to. The symbolism is clear enough that players understand without needing it spelled out, but oblique enough that it can pass ratings boards. Years later, translator Jeremy Blaustein confirmed what players had suspected. From the very beginning of development, Team Silent intended for Angela's background to include sexual abuse by her father and brother. They wanted to explore the psychological damage of incest and assault, to show how trauma like that warps a person's entire perception of reality. Masahiro Ito has confirmed multiple times on social media that Angela was sexually abused, that Abstract Daddy represents that abuse, and that the monster appears differently to Angela than it does to James, likely even more disturbing from her perspective. The game treats Angela's trauma with unusual respect for a horror title. She's never sexualized. Her clothing is defensive, covering her completely. She reacts to trauma in realistic ways, shutting down, lashing out, unable to trust anyone. The game doesn't exploit her suffering for shock value. Instead, it uses her story to explore how sexual abuse damages survivors, how it makes them see the world as fundamentally unsafe, how even people trying to help can seem threatening because the violation has destroyed their ability to trust. Angela's final scene remains one of the most powerful moments in gaming. James finds her on a staircase engulfed in flames. He sees a normal staircase. She sees fire everywhere. When he expresses surprise, she responds with one of the game's most memorable lines. "You see it too? For me, it's always like this." The world is always burning for Angela. The trauma she experiences is inescapable. She walks up the burning stairs toward oblivion, and James can't stop her. The game implies she's walking to her death, choosing to embrace the flames rather than continue living in a world that feels like hell. Team Silent could have handled this story many ways. They could have made Angela a damsel for James to save. They could have used her trauma for titillation or exploitation. Instead, they created a character whose abuse is central to understanding her but never defines her entirely, whose suffering is depicted with brutal honesty but never gratuitously, whose fate is tragic but also her own choice. The game acknowledges that some people don't recover from trauma. Some people find the weight too heavy to carry, and the world's response to trauma survivors is often inadequate at best, harmful at worst. The decision to include Angela's storyline was risky. Games in 2001 rarely tackle sexual abuse directly, especially child sexual abuse. Team Silent knew they were crossing into territory that would make people deeply uncomfortable, but they also understood that pretending such horrors don't exist, that people don't carry such trauma, would make Silent Hill 2 less honest, less meaningful. Horror that only shows you monsters you can fight misses the truth that the worst monsters are human and the worst damage is psychological. Still, the approach generated criticism. Some argued that depicting sexual abuse in a horror game, even tastefully, risked trivializing real trauma for entertainment purposes. Others felt that abstract Daddy's design, while symbolic, was too explicit in its sexual imagery. When Bloober Team announced they were remaking Silent Hill 2, concerns immediately arose about how they would handle Angela's story, especially given Bloober's controversial treatment of sexual abuse in their game The Medium, which many critics felt mishandled similar themes. The Silent Hill 2 remake ultimately kept Angela's story largely intact, though some details changed. The debate continues about whether horror games can or should depict sexual trauma, whether doing so serves survivors by acknowledging their pain or harms them by using that pain as content. Team Silent believes strongly that psychological horror must confront real psychological trauma, that horror divorced from real horror loses power. Whether they succeeded or overstepped likely depends on each player's personal experience and perspective. Pyramid Head, Violence and Sexuality. No Silent Hill monster is more iconic than Pyramid Head, and no Silent Hill monster has generated more controversy about its depictions of violence and sexuality. The creature's first appearance in Silent Hill 2 set the tone for what would become one of gaming's most debated scenes. James encounters Pyramid Head early in the game through bars in a hallway. The creature stands on the other side, handling two leg creature mannequins. The camera angle and positioning suggest a sexual act. The mannequins seem to struggle. Then Pyramid Head drives his weapon through them, killing them. The scene lasts only moments, but the implication is clear, the imagery disturbing. Pyramid Head appears to be sexually assaulting the mannequins while killing them, conflating sex and violence in a way that's deeply unsettling. Later, James enters an apartment room and finds Pyramid Head in a longer scene with two mannequins. This time the sexual positioning is even clearer. The mannequins' legs are spread. Pyramid Head makes thrusting motions, then he kills them. James, hiding in a closet, shoots at Pyramid Head until sirens sound and the creature leaves. The mannequins represent memories or aspects of Mary, James's dead wife. Pyramid Head forces James to watch what appears to be the violation and destruction of those memories, making James confront his own guilt and self-hatred through witnessing these acts. The scene generated immediate controversy. Players debated whether Pyramid Head was actually committing sexual assault or if the positioning was coincidental, if the sexual imagery was intentional or accidental. Many interpreted the scene as Pyramid Head raping the mannequins. Gaming forums exploded with discussions about whether the scene was artistic exploration of dark themes or simply disturbing content included for shock value. Masahiro Ito has addressed this controversy multiple times over the years, and his responses have been consistent. Pyramid Head is not raping the mannequins. The creature is killing them, removing them from James's mind. Ito admits the motions look sexual, acknowledges he deliberately designed them to appear that way, but maintains the actual act is murder, not rape. The sexual appearance serves a symbolic purpose, reflecting James's conflation of sex and death, his guilt over feeling sexual frustration during Mary's illness, his subconscious connection between desire and violence. However, Ito also understands why players interpret the scene as depicting rape. The symbolism is so heavy, the positioning so suggestive, that many people see sexual violence regardless of authorial intent. And in some ways, that ambiguity serves the game. Whether Pyramid Head is actually assaulting the mannequins or only appears to be, James experiences it as violation. He watches something horrific happening to manifestations of his wife. The trauma is real to him regardless of the technical details. This debate intensified when discussing Silent Hill 2's remake. Early interviews with Bloober Team saw developers ask directly if the Pyramid Head scene had been altered. They refused to comment, clearly giving non-answers about staying faithful while modernizing for contemporary audiences. This ambiguity led to speculation that the scene had been censored, which generated backlash from fans who felt the game's psychological horror required uncomfortable content. When the remake released, the scene remained, but with modifications. The camera angles changed, the imagery became less explicit. Some fans argued this reduced the scene's impact. Others felt it retained the essential unsettling quality while reducing potentially exploitative elements. Ito himself noted that people had spread interpretations of the scene as canon that were never intended, and seemed somewhat exasperated that fans insisted on reading sexual assault into what he designed as symbolic violence. The broader issue remains: when horror uses sexual imagery, when does it become exploitation rather than exploration? Pyramid Head works as a symbol of James's guilt and self-punishment, partly because the sexual violence imagery makes players deeply uncomfortable. If that discomfort serves the narrative, helps players understand James's fractured psyche, then perhaps the disturbing content has purpose. But if players walk away feeling like they witnessed assault as entertainment, even symbolically, then the line between meaningful horror and exploitative content becomes blurred. Silent Hill 2 doesn't provide easy answers. It presents disturbing imagery and trusts players to grapple with it. Some players found that approach brilliant, forcing them to confront their own discomfort and question what they were seeing. Others found it unnecessarily graphic, feeling that horror games shouldn't depict even symbolic sexual violence. And some felt the ambiguity itself was the problem, that Team Silent should have been clearer about what Pyramid Head was actually doing, rather than creating imagery that could be interpreted as rape. The scene remains in every version of the game, altered slightly in some releases and remakes, but never removed. It stands as one of gaming's most controversial moments, admired by some for its psychological depth and condemned by others for its potentially exploitative imagery. Whether it represents horror at its most psychologically complex or horror crossing lines, it shouldn't cross likely depends on individual interpretation and personal boundaries around depictions of sexual violence. Silent Hill 3: Abortion and Body Horror. Silent Hill 3 pushed boundaries in different directions, using body horror and religious imagery to tell a story that many interpret as an allegory for forced pregnancy and abortion. The game stars Heather Mason, who discovers she carries the seed of God inside her body, implanted without her consent, growing despite her wishes, threatening to destroy her if brought to term. The pregnancy metaphor isn't subtle. Heather repeatedly experiences pain and nausea. She touches her stomach and feels something wrong inside her. Claudia Wolf, the game's antagonist and a religious fanatic, insists that Heather must give birth to God, that her body belongs to this higher purpose, that her wishes are irrelevant compared to the importance of the deity growing within her. Heather responds with disgust and rage, expressing clearly that she does not consent, that this thing inside her is a violation, that she will do anything to remove it. The game fills itself with fetus imagery. Players encounter monsters that look like skinless infants. The other world features walls that pulse like flesh, blood flowing through visible veins. In the hospital section, Heather finds a coat hanger, which she straightens and uses to reach a ladder. Players familiar with the history of illegal abortions immediately recognize the symbolism. Wire coat hangers were infamous instruments used for dangerous self-induced abortions before the procedure was legalized. The game never explicitly connects the hanger to abortion, but the context makes the implication impossible to miss. The climax of Silent Hill 3 features one of the most disturbing scenes in the franchise. Heather remembers the pendant her father Harry gave her, opens it, and swallows a red pill inside. She then vomits up the fetus of God. The scene is graphic. The expelled fetus is bloody, skinless, and wailing. Heather attempts to stomp on it, to destroy it completely, preventing Claudia's plan. But Claudia picks up the dying fetus and swallows it herself, choosing to give birth to God even if it means her own death. This sequence generated significant debate. Some players and critics saw it as a powerful statement about bodily autonomy, depicting a woman who refuses to let her body be used against her will, who takes drastic action to remove something implanted without consent. The game treats Heather's decision as correct and necessary. She didn't ask for God to be inside her. She didn't want to give birth. The act of expelling the fetus is portrayed as reclaiming control of her own body. Others found the scene exploitative or insensitive, arguing that depicting abortion, even symbolically, in a horror game trivialized a serious medical procedure and the complex ethical questions surrounding it. The graphic nature of the scene, showing a bloody screaming fetus, felt to some critics like it was designed for shock value rather than meaningful commentary. And the fact that Claudia immediately swallows the fetus, turning the moment into even more extreme body horror, seemed to push beyond exploration into exploitation. Team Silent has never confirmed whether the abortion reading was intentional. In interviews, they've discussed themes of motherhood, religious control over women's bodies, and Heather's struggle against people trying to control her. But they've been vague about whether they meant to create an abortion allegory specifically. This ambiguity might be strategic, allowing the game to explore these themes without explicitly stating them, passing ratings boards that might have demanded cuts if the abortion symbolism had been overt. The game also features extensive sexual imagery in its monster designs. The first monster Heather encounters, the Closer, has a distinctly phallic head design, wears a miniskirt, and attacks by vomiting acid. Many monsters in Silent Hill 3 reference female anatomy or sexual violence in their designs, reflecting both the sexual trauma Heather carries from Alessa's memories and the theme of forced pregnancy. The game uses sexual horror more extensively than Silent Hill 2, though in different ways, focusing on violation and bodily autonomy rather than guilt and desire. Silent Hill 3 also continues the franchise's willingness to depict religious fanaticism as fundamentally harmful. Claudia believes absolutely in paradise, convinced that birthing God will cleanse the world despite the suffering required. She has Harry murdered to fuel Heather's hatred, believing that negative emotions will nourish the God inside Heather. The game presents religious zealotry as monstrous, showing believers willing to murder, torture, and violate bodily autonomy for their cause. This anti-religious stance, combined with the abortion allegory, made Silent Hill 3 particularly controversial in some religious communities. The game crossed lines by depicting forced pregnancy as horror, by showing a fetus as something to be expelled and destroyed, by treating the desire not to give birth as heroic rather than villainous. These are deeply controversial positions in many cultures and communities. Team Silent could have told Heather's story without the pregnancy metaphor, without the abortion imagery, without the explicitness of the vomiting scene. They chose not to. They chose to make a statement about bodily autonomy and religious control, to depict forced pregnancy as violation, to show a protagonist who refuses to give birth regardless of the consequences. Whether that choice was brave or insensitive, artistically justified or exploitative, remains debated. The game certainly succeeded in disturbing players. The fetus scene is unforgettable, burned into the memory of everyone who played Silent Hill 3. But was it meaningful discomfort that provoked thought about bodily autonomy and religious control? Or was it simply grotesque imagery designed to shock? Each player must decide for themselves where that line falls. Censorship, what was cut? Not all of Silent Hill's boundary-pushing content made it into the final games. Various releases faced censorship from ratings boards and publishers, especially in Germany and Australia, countries with stricter content regulations. Examining what was cut reveals both how far Silent Hill pushed and where even this franchise met limits it couldn't cross. Silent Hill, Homecoming faced the most extensive censorship. In Germany, numerous scenes were modified or removed entirely. The scene where protagonist Alex rams a drill into Dr. Holloway's chin cuts to black before the drill makes contact. The scene where the judge works on Alex's leg with a drill includes a privacy screen blocking the view. The scene where Holloway hits Alex in the eye fades to black before contact. And the climactic scene where the bogeyman kills Alex's father by splitting him in half was edited to remove the bisection, showing the father simply fall instead. Australia's rating board initially refused classification for Homecoming entirely, effectively banning the game. The scenes deemed too extreme included violence against children and extreme gore. Konami submitted an edited version that removed the child torture implications and reduced some gore effects. Even with these cuts, the Australian version remained controversial, with many players importing the uncensored version from other regions. Silent Hill 2's original release also faced minor censorship in different regions. Some versions removed or reduced the screaming in the scene where James suffocates Mary. The North American release toned down the audio, making Mary's death quieter and less explicitly struggling. Players who later discovered the uncensored Japanese version reported finding it significantly more disturbing, with Mary clearly fighting against James, screaming and struggling before finally going silent. The censored version could be interpreted as Mary accepting death peacefully. The uncensored version makes clear this was murder against her will. The Silent Hill 2 HD collection faced different issues. Technical problems dominated discussion of that release, but some players noted changes to monster designs and scene framing that seemed to reduce sexual imagery. Whether these were artistic decisions, technical limitations, or actual censorship remains debated. The remake faced similar scrutiny, with every modification analyzed for potential censorship before release. Silent Hill F, the upcoming entry set in 1960s Japan, has already generated controversy over its content warnings. The game's official website includes extensive disclaimers about depictions of gender discrimination, child abuse, bullying, drug-induced hallucinations, torture, and graphic violence. The disclaimer specifically notes the game is set in 1960s Japan and contains depictions based on customs and culture of that time, emphasizing these depictions don't reflect the developer's values. The warning even advises players to take breaks or speak to someone they trust if uncomfortable. This level of warning is unusual even for horror games. It suggests Silent Hill F will tackle extremely dark subject matter, possibly including period-accurate depictions of gender discrimination and child abuse. that would be unacceptable in modern settings but historically accurate for the era. Whether the game will actually deliver on these warnings, or if the extensive disclaimer is primarily covering legal bases, remains to be seen. But the warnings alone have generated significant discussion about whether horror games should come with such detailed content warnings, and whether doing so actually helps players or simply creates controversy. The censorship history reveals that even Silent Hill had limits. Ratings boards drew lines that Team Silent sometimes crossed, requiring cuts to receive certification. But it also shows how different cultures draw those lines in different places. What passed uncut in Japan or America sometimes required modification for Germany or Australia. What seemed acceptable in 2001 might require warnings or modifications in 2025. The boundaries of acceptable horror content shift over time and across cultures, and Silent Hill has consistently tested those boundaries, sometimes successfully crossing them and sometimes being pushed back. The remake debates, modern sensibilities, the announcement and release of remakes for Silent Hill 2 and eventually other entries in the franchise reignited debates about the series' controversial content. Bloober Team, the studio developing the Silent Hill 2 remake, faced immediate scrutiny over how they would handle the game's sexual and traumatic content, especially given their controversial handling of similar themes in their game, The Medium. The Medium featured a storyline involving childhood sexual abuse that many critics felt was handled insensitively. The game depicted a character who was abused as a child growing up to become an abuser himself, creating a cycle of abuse narrative that suggested victims inevitably become perpetrators. The game's ending had a young woman who was sexually abused as a child asking to be killed, presented as the only way to end the cycle of abuse. Critics argued this sent a harmful message to real abuse survivors, suggesting they were damaged beyond repair, that their trauma would inevitably lead them to harm others, or that death was preferable to living with trauma. When Bloober Team was announced as the developer for the Silent Hill 2 remake, fans immediately worried they would mishandle Angela's story. Would they understand the nuance with which Team Silent approached her trauma? Would they avoid the mistakes they'd made in The Medium? Or would Angela's story become yet another example of trauma depicted insensitively? Early interviews didn't help. When asked directly about the Pyramid Head scene and whether it had been modified, developers gave evasive non-answers about taking a safe approach and being faithful while modernizing. This ambiguity led to speculation about censorship, with some fans worried the game would be sanitized and others hoping explicit content would be reduced. The debate became heated, with accusations of woke censorship from some corners and calls for responsible modernization from others. The actual remake, when released, handled the controversial content with surprising care. Angela's story remained intact, with the abstract daddy boss fight and the burning staircase scene preserved. The sexual symbolism was present but slightly reduced, with camera angles and lighting changed to make the imagery less explicit while maintaining the disturbing atmosphere. Bloober Team seemed to have learned from their mistakes with the medium, treating Angela's trauma with the respect it deserved. The Pyramid Head scene was modified more significantly. The camera cuts away more quickly from the mannequin scene. The sexual positioning is less explicit. Some fans argued this reduced the scene's impact, making Pyramid Head less disturbing. Others felt the modifications retained the essential psychological horror while removing potentially exploitative imagery. Masahiro Ito's comments about the scene not originally being intended as rape vindicated some of these changes to players who felt the remake was closer to the original intent than fan interpretations had been. Maria's design generated particular controversy. In the original game, Maria wears a crop top showing her midriff and a butterfly tattoo above her navel. The remake covers her midriff and moves the tattoo to her chest. Some players viewed this as censorship, arguing that Maria's sexual appearance was essential to her character as a manifestation of James's desires. Others pointed out that the original design was already more modest than many players remembered, and the remake's version maintained Maria's deliberate contrast with the modest Mary while reducing the degree of sexualization. Character model changes also sparked debate. Angela's appearance in the remake was criticized by some for being less conventionally attractive than in the original, with complaints about her looking too masculine. These complaints largely came from people who seemed to misunderstand Angela's character entirely. Her design is deliberately unglamorous. She's a trauma survivor, not an object of desire. The criticism revealed uncomfortable attitudes about female characters, suggesting some players expected even abuse survivors in horror games to be conventionally attractive. The debate around the remake reflects broader tensions in gaming about how to handle mature content in modern releases. Some players argue that faithfulness requires preserving everything from the original, including content that hasn't aged well or that modern sensibilities find problematic. Others argue that games should evolve with cultural understanding, that depicting trauma responsibly matters more than perfect recreation of controversial content from decades ago. Silent Hill 2's remake ultimately threaded this needle fairly successfully. It retained the disturbing content that makes the game meaningful while reducing some of the most exploitative feeling imagery. It respected the original's darkness while acknowledging that some approaches to depicting trauma have evolved since 2001. Whether this balance satisfied everyone is doubtful, but it demonstrated that remakes can modernize controversial content without sanitizing it entirely. Silent Hill's OC legacy. Did crossing lines matter? After examining all these moments when Silent Hill pushed boundaries, violated taboos, and crossed lines other games wouldn't approach, we're left with the central question: did it matter? Did Silent Hill's willingness to depict child torture, sexual abuse, forced pregnancy, and symbolic sexual violence make the games more meaningful? Or did Team Silent sometimes mistake shock value for depth? The answer is complicated and probably different for each controversial element. Alessa's story works because it doesn't exploit her suffering for entertainment. The game treats her trauma as the foundation of everything, the original sin from which all other horror flows. You never see the burning in graphic detail. You see the aftermath, the consequences, the way that trauma warps reality itself. This approach respects the severity of what happened while using it to explore themes about religious fanaticism, parental betrayal, and the power of suffering to literally reshape the world. Angela's storyline similarly succeeds because it treats sexual abuse as trauma rather than spectacle. The game never shows the abuse directly. You see only Angela's reactions, the manifestation of her trauma and abstract daddy, the way she can't trust anyone because trust was violated so fundamentally. The power comes from restraint, from showing how abuse damages rather than depicting the abuse itself. Team Silent understood that horror often works better through implication and aftermath than through explicit depiction. The sexual symbolism around the nurses and Pyramid Head occupies more ambiguous territory. These designs work as psychological exploration of James's guilt and shame, forcing players to confront uncomfortable truths about sexual frustration, inappropriate desire, and the conflation of sex and death. But they also risk feeling exploitative. using sexual imagery for shock value under the cover of symbolic meaning. Whether you find them brilliant or problematic likely depends on whether you believe the sexual content serves the narrative or simply sensationalizes it. Silent Hill 3's abortion allegory and body horror push even further into controversial territory. The game makes a clear statement about bodily autonomy and religious control, but does so through imagery that many find genuinely disturbing. The vomited fetus scene serves a thematic purpose, showing Heather's desperate reclamation of her own body, but it's also grotesque in ways that feel designed purely to disgust. The line between meaningful horror and exploitative shock becomes very thin. What separates Silent Hill from other games that tried to be edgy or controversial is that Team Silent, at their best, understood why they were crossing lines. They didn't include disturbing content randomly. Each controversial element connected to themes they were exploring about trauma, guilt, religious control, sexual shame, and the way suffering damages people. The horror wasn't just there to shock, it was there to make you think, to make you uncomfortable in ways that revealed truths about human psychology and trauma. But Team Silent also sometimes made mistakes. Some content feels more shocking than meaningful. Some imagery seems designed primarily to disturb rather than to serve thematic purposes, and the franchise's influence led to many imitators who copied the surface level shock without understanding the thematic depth underneath, creating a wave of horror games that thought being disturbing was the same as being deep. The franchise's willingness to tackle taboo subjects opened doors for other games to explore difficult themes. Later horror titles felt emboldened to depict trauma, abuse, and psychological damage in more honest ways. Games like Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, What Remains of Edith Finch, and The Last of Us Part 2 tackle mental illness, child death, and cycles of violence, partly because Silent Hill proved games could handle such content meaningfully. But Silent Hill's legacy also includes games that mistook shock for substance, that depicted trauma exploitatively, that used controversial content as marketing rather than meaningful exploration. For every game that learned from Silent Hill's successes, another learned only that controversy generates attention. The line between impactful horror and exploitative shock that Silent Hill walked so carefully became a line that many subsequent games stampeded across without understanding what they were doing. The question of responsibility: horror creators face a responsibility that creators in other genres often don't consider as deeply. The responsibility to depict trauma, violence, and suffering without exploiting the people who've experienced those things in reality. When you show child torture, when you depict sexual abuse, when you create imagery around forced pregnancy or assault, you're engaging with experiences that have damaged real people. The question becomes whether you're doing so respectfully, exploring trauma to create understanding and empathy, or whether you're using real pain as content, as spectacle, as entertainment. Team Silent believed strongly that psychological horror required depicting real psychological trauma. They felt that horror divorced from real horror loses its power, becomes fantasy that audiences can dismiss easily. If your monsters are just monsters, if your horror is just atmosphere and jump scares, then players can walk away without being changed. But if your horror connects to real trauma, real suffering, real damage that happens to real people, then it stays with you. It makes you think. It creates genuine discomfort rather than just manufactured fear. This philosophy is evident throughout the series. Alessa's story connects to real cases of religious abuse of children. Angela's story reflects the experiences of real sexual abuse survivors. The nurses embody shame and guilt that many people experience around desire and mortality. The horror works because it's rooted in psychological truth, because it reflects damage that actually happens to human beings. But that approach also carries risks. Real trauma survivors play these games. People who've experienced sexual abuse encounter Angela's story. People who've lost children to religious extremism see Alessa's suffering. The question becomes whether the game helps them feel seen and validated, or whether it exploits their pain for entertainment, whether it creates understanding in people who haven't experienced such trauma, or whether it simply uses trauma as horror content. Team Silent tried to handle this responsibly. They didn't show abuse directly. They focused on aftermath and manifestation rather than the acts themselves. They gave traumatized characters agency, allowing them to fight back even if they couldn't win. They treated trauma as damage rather than weakness, showing how suffering changes people without defining them entirely by their suffering. But they also made mistakes. Some imagery feels more exploitative than explorative. Some content seems designed to shock rather than to enlighten. And the fact that so many subsequent games learned the wrong lessons, copying Silent Hill's controversial content without understanding its thematic purpose, suggests that perhaps Team Silent's approach was too easily misunderstood or misused. The responsibility question has no easy answer. Horror can explore trauma meaningfully. It can create empathy and understanding. It can make people who've never experienced certain suffering understand what it feels like, at least in some small way. But it can also exploit. It can trivialize. It can use real pain as entertainment without contributing anything meaningful. The line between these outcomes is often thin and subjective, varying based on individual experiences and perspectives. Silent Hill, at its best, understood this responsibility and tried to honor it. The games depicted trauma carefully, focusing on psychological manifestation rather than explicit depiction, giving traumatized characters complexity and agency. At its worst, Silent Hill sometimes prioritized shock value, creating imagery that felt more exploitative than meaningful. And the franchise's legacy includes both games that learned to handle difficult subjects responsibly and games that learned only that controversy sells. Conclusion: the fog still hasn't lifted. Silent Hill crossed lines repeatedly, deliberately, sometimes brilliantly, and sometimes questionably. The franchise showed game developers that horror could engage with real trauma, could explore psychological damage honestly, could tackle subjects most games avoided entirely. It proved that games could be more than entertainment, could be explorations of human suffering that created genuine understanding and empathy. But it also showed how easily meaningful horror can become exploitative horror, how thin the line is between impactful content and shock value, how controversy can be both purposeful and problematic. Team Silent's willingness to push boundaries opened doors, but also created a roadmap that many developers followed to destinations Team Silent never intended. The debates continue with each new Silent Hill release and remake. What should be preserved? What should be modified? How should modern developers handle content created in different cultural contexts with different understandings of trauma and representation? There are no perfect answers. Every decision to change controversial content generates backlash from people who value faithfulness over sensitivity. Every decision to preserve controversial content generates criticism from people who find it exploitative or harmful. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that Silent Hill's controversial content worked when it served thematic purposes, when it explored trauma meaningfully rather than exploiting it for shock value. Alessa's story remains powerful because it treats child abuse as the foundational tragedy that warps everything else, not as spectacle. Angela's story works because it shows the aftermath of sexual abuse with brutal honesty while never depicting the abuse itself. These are moments when Silent Hill crossed lines in ways that mattered, that added depth rather than just controversy. But some of Silent Hill's boundary pushing feels less essential, more designed to shock than to illuminate. Some imagery seems to exist more for controversy than for thematic coherence, and the franchise's influence includes both meaningful explorations of trauma and exploitative uses of controversial content. The legacy is mixed, the impact complicated. What remains clear is that Silent Hill changed horror gaming permanently. It proved games could tackle difficult subjects, could explore trauma and abuse and suffering in ways that other media had done, but games largely avoided. It showed that psychological horror could be truly psychological, rooted in real human damage rather than just atmosphere and monsters. Whether every boundary Silent Hill crossed needed crossing, whether every line transgressed served meaningful purposes, remains debatable, but the willingness to cross those lines, to push into uncomfortable territory, to risk controversy in pursuit of meaningful horror, that changed gaming forever. The fog still surrounds Silent Hill. We're still trying to see through it clearly, still debating whether what we glimpse in that fog is profound or just disturbing, whether the horror serves purposes beyond itself or exists primarily to shock and unsettle. Perhaps that ambiguity is itself the point. Perhaps the best horror doesn't provide easy answers, doesn't let you feel comfortable with simple interpretations. Perhaps Silent Hill's greatest accomplishment was creating horror that still generates discussion and debate decades later, that still makes people examine their own boundaries and consider where lines should be drawn. The sirens have long since faded, the other world has receded, but the questions Silent Hill raised about horror, trauma, responsibility, and the boundaries of acceptable content in games continue echoing. And that might be the real legacy, not just the specific moments when Silent Hill crossed lines, but the ongoing conversation about whether those transgressions were necessary, whether they were meaningful, whether they made horror games better or just more controversial. The line Silent Hill walked between meaningful horror and exploitative shock remains as foggy and uncertain as the streets of the town itself. And maybe, in the end, that's exactly where the line should be, visible enough to see that it exists, obscured enough that we keep questioning where exactly it falls. Silent Hill crossed the line. Whether that made it brilliant or problematic or somehow both at once, that's a question each player must answer for themselves, alone in the fog, with only their own boundaries to guide them.